I used to think betrayal would announce itself with thunder. I thought if my husband ever stopped loving me, I would feel the sky crack open, some seismic warning that would give me time to brace. Nobody tells you that betrayal usually arrives wearing a pressed shirt and smelling faintly of cologne, smiling the same smile that made you fall for him in the first place. My name is Vivian Hale. 3 days before the worst night of my life, I had given birth to my daughter, Josephine, in a private suite on the 14th floor of St. Augustine's Women's Hospital, overlooking the East River. 3 days of no sleep, of stitches that pulled every time I shifted in the bed, of a love so enormous it frightened me. 3 days of believing, foolishly, that I finally had everything. I did not know yet that in exactly 4 hours, my husband would take my car keys off the nightstand, kiss my forehead like he was closing out a business meeting, and leave me and our newborn daughter to find our own way home. I did not know that this was only the first betrayal. Not the worst one, just the first. The afternoon light came through the hospital window in long gold bars, catching the dust that drifted above the vase of white roses my mother had sent. I remember thinking, absurdly, that the roses were the exact color of the blanket wrapped around Josie, a cashmere heirloom that had swaddled 3 generations of Hale babies before her. She was sleeping against my chest, her small fist curled beneath her chin, and for a moment the ache in my body did not matter at all. Then I looked at the clock. 4:15. Discharge should have happened an hour ago. Grant was standing near the window with his phone pressed to his ear, and something about the posture of him struck me as wrong before I could name it. He wasn't wearing the soft gray sweatpants he'd packed specifically for the ride home. He joked about it 2 weeks earlier, said he wanted to be comfortable when he carried his daughter into the world for the first time. Instead, he was in the charcoal button-down he wore to court new clients, sleeves crisp, collar open just enough to look effortless. He looked like a man dressed for something important. He did not look like a man dressed to drive his wife and newborn home. "Of course, we're so grateful you held it," he was murmuring into the phone, that low, practiced tone he used when he wanted someone to feel important. "We'll be there by 7. He hung up and turned to me, and there it was, the smile. Bright, boyish, disarming. The same smile that had found me across a crowded ballroom 2 years earlier at my father's foundation gala, when Grant Whitmore had walked up in a borrowed tuxedo that fit him too well and asked if the seat beside me was taken. I had thought, at the time, that it was the smile of a man who had nothing to prove. I understand now that it was the smile of a man who had learned exactly how much a smile could get him. "That was Etienne," he said, sliding the phone into his pocket. "The maitre d' at Maison Auray, confirming our table. He heard about the baby, sent his congratulations." I shifted Josie carefully against my shoulder, feeling the pull of the incision beneath my ribs. "Grant, the doctor still hasn't signed off. We need to get her home." I know, he waved a hand, the gesture of a man swatting away a minor inconvenience. "But can you believe it? 3 months we've been trying to get that table. 3 months, and Etienne is holding it himself." His eyes were bright with an excitement that had nothing to do with the daughter sleeping on my chest. "My parents are already on their way into the city. They're thrilled." Something cold began to pool in my stomach. "Your parents are coming to the restaurant?" "Well, yes." His smile flickered, just at the edges, like a lamp with a loose wire. "Vivian, be reasonable. It's one dinner. My mother has been talking about this reservation for weeks. She wants to celebrate her granddaughter properly." "I thought," I said slowly, "that celebrating properly meant you driving us home, together. Our first night as a family, in our own bed, with our daughter." "You'll be home in an hour. I'll get you a car service, a good one, the kind with the leather seats and the little bottles of water. I'll be back before you're even settled." He came and perched on the edge of the bed, resting a hand on my leg. It was heavy. Not comforting. Heavy. Like a weight placed there to keep me still. "Sweetheart, you and Josie are perfectly safe here. This is the safest place in the city for you to be right now. Let me have this one night. I've barely slept either, you know. I need something that feels normal." I stared at him. Somewhere behind my ribs, under the ache of stitches and exhaustion, I felt something small and important begin to crack. "You want me to take a taxi home with our 3-day-old daughter," I said, "while you take my car to a 5-star dinner with your parents." The mask slipped, just for a second, just long enough for me to see the irritation underneath, the flash of a man who resented being made to explain himself. "For God's sake, Vivian, don't be dramatic. It's my car too. Or did you forget we're married?" "I haven't forgotten anything," I said, my voice trembling now, despite every effort to keep it steady. "I haven't forgotten that you promised. I haven't forgotten that this was supposed to be about us, about her." "This is about family," he shot back, rising off the bed, his voice climbing. "My parents are family too. They want to see their granddaughter, and I want one night, Vivian, to feel like a person again, instead of a man who smells like a hospital ward and talks about diaper rash. Is that too much to ask after everything I've given up for this?" The word landed like a slap. Given up. "What exactly have you given up, Grant?" "Plenty." His voice cracked with something that might have been real feeling, or might have been performance. By then, I had stopped being able to tell the difference. "My freedom. My identity. Do you have any idea what it's like to walk into a room and know every single person is thinking, 'There's Vivian Hale's husband'? To work twice as hard just to prove I'm not some accessory to your family's name." I looked at him. Really looked. The way you look at a stranger's face after they've said something that changes what you know about them. This was the man I had chosen to be my daughter's father, standing in a hospital room 3 days after I'd nearly died bringing his child into the world, complaining about his ego. "Get out," I whispered. The fight had drained out of me, replaced by something colder and stiller. He mistook it for surrender. The smile came back, easy as sunrise. "So, we're settled. I'll call for the car. You'll be fine. You're the strongest person I know." He leaned down and kissed my forehead, dry and quick, a transaction rather than an affection. Then his gaze caught on the set of keys sitting on the bedside table. The keys to the Aurora GT I had bought myself as a push present, black and sleek, the one indulgence I'd allowed myself in 9 months of maternity leggings and swollen ankles. He picked them up, jingled them once in his palm like he was testing their weight. "I'll take this. Easier to get my parents from the hotel." I didn't say anything. I couldn't. I just held Josie tighter and turned my face toward the window, toward Central Park going gold and gray in the last of the daylight, and listened to the sound of his shoes on the linoleum, the door opening, the door closing. Silence swallowed the room whole. An hour later, a nurse came in with the discharge papers, her clipboard tucked under her arm and a kind, tired smile on her face. "All set, hun? Is your husband bringing the car around?" "He had a prior engagement," I said, and I heard how strange my own voice sounded, flat and careful, like I was reading someone else's line. "I'll need a taxi." The nurse's smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered it, professionally, the way people do when they decide not to ask the question sitting behind their eyes. She helped me into a wheelchair. A porter carried the diaper bag and the small overnight case my mother had packed. Josie rode against my chest in a carrier that still smelled of the plastic wrapping it had come in, purchased and assembled with such hope only weeks before. The lobby doors slid open onto the cool bite of a New York evening in early spring, and I remember flinching at it, the way the noise and the wind and the honking taxis rushed in after 3 days of climate-controlled silence. A doorman helped me into the back of a yellow cab that smelled of stale air freshener and someone else's cigarette smoke, the vinyl seat cold through my hospital-discharged sweatpants. I gave the driver our address on Central Park West and watched the hospital shrink in the rear windshield. My phone buzzed in my lap. A photograph. Grant, grinning. A glass of something amber-colored raised toward the camera, his parents flanking him with the particular flushed happiness of people 3 courses into an excellent meal. Behind them, soft gold light and white tablecloths, a wall of wine bottles glowing like a cathedral of glass. The caption read, "Wish you were here, the scallops are unreal, XO." A sound came out of me that I didn't recognize. Not quite a sob, not quite a laugh, something in between. Something a person makes when the absurdity of a thing outpaces their ability to feel it properly. I opened the location sharing app on my phone, the one we had turned on years earlier as a silly, romantic gesture, so we would always know the other was safe. A small pulsing dot marked my own position, crawling up through midtown traffic. Another dot, labeled Aurora, sat motionless on West 51st Street. I watched that dot for the entire ride uptown. It never moved. He was there, laughing, sipping wine, celebrating a daughter he hadn't stayed long enough to actually meet the way a father should. Not glancing at the clock, not counting the minutes until he could see her open her eyes, while I sat in a stranger's taxi with stitches burning beneath my ribs, watching Manhattan slide past the window one indifferent block at a time. When the cab finally pulled up outside our building, our doorman, Malcolm, came rushing out with his coat still unbuttoned, his face arranging itself into confused concern. "Mrs. Whitmore, I wasn't told. Let me help you." He lifted Josie's carrier as gently as if it held something made of glass and offered me his arm. I walked into the marble lobby leaning on a 70-year-old doorman, my newborn daughter cradled against a stranger's chest, and felt the silence of the penthouse waiting above me like a verdict. It was supposed to be a homecoming. It felt like a sentence. The apartment, when Malcolm finally got us through the door, was dark and spotless and utterly, ringingly empty. The particular emptiness of a space designed by someone with excellent taste and no one currently in it to enjoy the design. I took Josie from her carrier, sank onto the enormous cold leather sofa that had cost more than most people's cars, and finally let myself cry. They were not sad tears. They were something colder than sadness. A fury so clean and precise, it felt like ice moving through my veins. I looked at my phone. The dot was still parked outside Maison Aurée. I thought of his words in the hospital room. "After everything I've given up." I scrolled through my contacts, past Priya, my best friend since business school, who would offer sympathy I didn't have the strength to receive yet. Past my mother, who would worry before she would act, until I found the name that mattered. Dad. I took a breath that hurt all the way down and pressed call. It rang twice. "Vivian." My father's voice filled the line, warm, immediate, wide awake despite the hour in Geneva, where he and my mother had gone for a week of meetings before flying home for the birth. "How's my girl? How's my granddaughter? Are you home yet? Did everything go?" "Daddy." The word came out smaller than I meant it to, and I hated myself a little for that, for the child's voice that still lived somewhere under the CEO's daughter, the woman who ran her own division, the mother who had just delivered a baby without a single complaint. "I'm home, alone, with your granddaughter." Grant took my car to have dinner with his parents at Maison Aurée. The silence on the line was not confusion, it was calculation. I had heard that particular silence in boardrooms my entire life, the sound of my father recalibrating, deciding how large a threat had just been identified and how quickly it needed to be neutralized. "Say that again," he said. His voice had gone very quiet, very even. It was more frightening than shouting would have been. I told him everything. The button-down shirt instead of the sweatpants, the phone call with the maitre d', the argument, as close to word for word as I could reconstruct it through the fog of exhaustion. After everything I've given up for this, the dismissive kiss on my forehead, the jangle of my own car keys leaving my apartment in another man's hand, the taxi, the smell of it, the photograph of the scallops. When I finished, my father was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, in a voice colder than I had ever heard him use, even during the hostile takeover attempt that had nearly cost him the company 11 years earlier, "The car, whose name is on the title?" "Mine. I bought it myself before I went into labor. Separate property." "Good. And the apartment?" "Also mine. Before the marriage. The prenup is explicit." "The joint accounts. How much does he have access to?" "The checking, the brokerage, maybe $2 million in liquid assets, combined." I heard, faintly, the scratch of a pen against paper. My father did not trust anything important to a phone or a screen. Important things went onto a yellow legal pad, the way they had for 40 years. "Listen to me very carefully, Vivian," he said. "You will not answer his calls tonight. You will not respond to a single text. You will lock the door, the deadbolt, and the chain both, though building security is excellent and I doubt it will come to that. I am calling Marcus. He and his team will be at your door within the hour. You will do exactly what he tells you. He speaks with my authority in this. Do you understand me?" "I understand." "This is what happens now," my father said, and something in his tone made the hair rise on my arms. Not because it frightened me, but because for the first time all night, I felt something other than helplessness. "First, we secure you and the baby. Second, we secure your assets, every account he has access to, frozen by morning. Third, we begin dismantling the life he believes he is entitled to." "Daddy," I said, some last thread of the woman I had been that morning still tugging at me. "He's her father." "He is a man," my father said, "who left his postpartum wife and newborn daughter to take a taxi home alone so he could eat scallops with his parents in your car. Whatever else he is, we will let a judge decide later. Tonight, you rest. Let us handle the rest." The call ended. I sat on the cold leather sofa with my daughter sleeping against my chest, and for the first time since the cab door had closed behind me, I did not feel entirely alone. Marcus Webb had been my father's attorney for as long as I could remember, and my godfather for even longer than that. He arrived at 11 that night with 2 associates in tow. A young woman named Priyanka Chen, who set up a laptop and a secure line on my dining table like she was defusing a bomb, and a junior associate named David, who carried 3 legal pads and a face that suggested he had not expected his Tuesday night to look like this. Marcus himself looked exactly as he always did, silver-haired, unhurried, dressed in a suit that had clearly been thrown on over pajamas, but somehow still looked immaculate. He sat across from me at the kitchen island, folded his hands, and studied my face for a long moment before he spoke. "Tell me everything," he said. "Leave nothing out. Even the parts that feel small. Small things win cases." So I told him. Again. The button-down shirt, the reservation, the argument, the keys. Somewhere in the telling, my voice finally broke, and Marcus reached over without a word and pressed a glass of water into my hand, waiting patiently while I gathered myself and kept going. When I finished, he nodded slowly, the way a surgeon nods before making the first cut. "Your phone," he said. "Leave it on silent, but where you can see it. We need a record of every attempt he makes to contact you tonight." Then he turned to his team, and the warmth in his face sharpened into something more clinical. "Priyanka, secure line to the office, pull the prenuptial agreement and every joint account statement from the last 2 years. David, draft 2 motions, an emergency order of protection and a petition for exclusive use of the marital residence along with temporary primary custody. Grounds: abandonment of a postpartum mother and infant and reckless endangerment." The words landed on me like small, precise blows. Abandonment, endangerment, custody. "Marcus," I said, "custody? That feels—" He looked at me, not unkindly, but without an ounce of give in his expression. "Vivian, we anchor high because the law rewards the party who moves first and moves clearly. A man leaving his 3-day-old daughter and the mother who just underwent major abdominal surgery to ride in her car to a 5-course dinner is not a detail a family court judge will forgive easily. We are not asking for anything we don't intend to actually pursue if it comes to that. We are simply making sure he understands from the first hour exactly how seriously this is being taken." For the next hour, I sat at my own kitchen island, now buried under legal pads and open laptops, and answered questions I had never expected to answer about my own marriage. Which accounts he could access, which cards were in his name and which were merely authorized, whether he held any equity, any board seat, any claim at all to Hale Media and Ventures, the company my great-grandfather had founded as a single failing newspaper, and that my father had built into an empire spanning 4 continents. "No equity," I said. "No board position. The prenup bars any claim against my separate property, and everything related to the company falls under that." "And his own business?" Marcus asked. "Whitmore Strategies. What do you know about its finances?" I hesitated, and in that hesitation I heard something I hadn't let myself hear before. That I actually knew very little. Grant had always waved off questions about his consulting firm with a laugh and a, "Don't worry about the boring stuff, that's my department." The same way, I realize now, that he'd waved off nearly everything he didn't want examined too closely. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "He handled that separately." Marcus and Priyanka exchanged a glance I didn't like. "We'll find out," Marcus said quietly, and something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. My phone, face up on the counter, lit up. Grant. It buzzed once, twice, a 3rd time in quick succession, then dissolved into a flurry of texts. "Babe, you're not picking up. Is Josie okay? Dinner was incredible. Mom and Dad can't wait to meet her tomorrow. Heading home now, should be there in 20. Did the car service get you back all right? Vivian. Seriously, pick up." "Don't touch it," Marcus said, watching the screen with the flat interest of a man watching a specimen under glass. "Let him talk to the void. Every message helps us establish the timeline. David, screenshot each one, timestamp everything." There was something surreal about watching my husband's messages, worried, then irritated, then something close to alarmed, cataloged as legal evidence in real time. Each buzz of the phone felt like a tiny hammer striking the last remaining wall of the life I'd believed I was living that morning. Marcus's own phone rang. He glanced at the screen, answered, and set it on speaker. "Robert, we're here. Vivian is with me. We're securing the residence." "Status," my father said. No greeting. In the background, I could hear the faint crackle of a fireplace. It was past 3 in the morning in Geneva. "Financial freeze in progress. Protective and custody petitions being drafted for an 8 a.m. filing. Physical security in place. Vivian is following protocol." Good. A pause, and then, in a tone I recognized from every hostile negotiation I'd watched him conduct across a boardroom table, I've made a few calls of my own. Whitmore Strategies' two largest retainers are with Kessler Group and Bryson Capital. I sit on Kessler's board. I've known Frank Bryson for 30 years. Both men were, let's say, deeply concerned to hear about the personal conduct of a consultant representing their firms. Both contracts are being terminated for cause, effective as of 9 a.m. Eastern. I sucked in a breath. It had taken my father less than 4 hours from 5,000 miles away in the middle of the night to begin dismantling my husband's entire professional life. The lease on his office in the Flatiron District, my father continued, is held by a Hale Real Estate Trust. Property management has been instructed to issue a notice of termination for violation of the morality clause. He'll have 30 days to vacate. Marcus was nodding, something almost like admiration flickering across his face. That'll add real pressure. Between the frozen accounts and the lost retainers, he'll feel the walls closing in by tomorrow afternoon. I don't want him to feel a pinch, Marcus, my father said, and his voice went colder than I had ever heard it. I want him to feel a vice, tight-knit. A beat. Vivian, are you there? I'm here, Daddy. This is the first move, he said. He will panic. He will call. He will threaten. He will say things designed to make you doubt yourself. You will not engage. You are a black hole tonight. You give him nothing. Marcus and his team are your voice now. You hold your daughter. Let the rest of us handle the war. Understood, I said. And I meant it, even as some small, exhausted part of me flinched at the word war attached to a marriage that, less than a week earlier, I would have called happy. The call ended. The apartment fell into a strange, charged quiet. Marcus looked at me over the rim of his glasses. He's not going to take this lying down, he said. A man like that doesn't slink away from a frozen bank account. He's going to come here, and he's going to be furious. As if summoned, my phone buzzed again. Not a call this time, a single text. I'm outside the building. My key fob isn't working. What the hell is going on? Let me in! Now! The buzzer sounded a moment later, insistent, 3 sharp rings in a row. We all looked at the panel by the door like it might bite us. Marcus rose without hurry and crossed the room. Don't speak, he told me quietly. Not a word. Let me. He pressed the button. Yes? Grant's voice exploded out of the speaker, warped by static and fury. Who is this? Where's Vivian? Amelia! Vivian! Open the damn door! The doorman won't let me up and my fob's dead! What kind of sick joke is this? Mr. Whitmore. Marcus's tone was a masterpiece of calm, professional neutrality, the vocal equivalent of a closed door. This is Marcus Webb of Webb, Sorensen, and Cole, representing Vivian Hale. I'm advising you not to attempt to gain access to this residence tonight. A stunned silence crackled through the intercom. Then a laugh, disbelieving, half hysterical. Webb? What is... Put Vivian on the phone right now! This is insane. We have a daughter. I'm afraid I can't do that, Marcus said. You've been served digital notice, to both your phone and your email, of several documents, including a temporary order of protection requiring you remain at least 500 feet from Ms. Hale and the minor child, Josephine Hale Whitmore, and granting Ms. Hale exclusive use of the marital residence pending further hearing. Any attempt to contact her or gain entry will constitute a violation of a court order. I'd strongly advise you review those documents and contact your own attorney. Another silence. This one felt different, heavier, more dangerous. When Grant's voice returned, it had dropped into a register I had never heard from him before, low and venomous. You set me up, he said. You and her father. You think you can lock me out of my own life? My own daughter? I'll have your license for this, Webb. I will burn this whole thing down. Let me talk to my wife. Miss Hale has nothing to say to you tonight, Marcus said, unmoved, and I'd remind you that threats made against counsel are themselves a matter we can bring before the court. Good night, Mr. Whitmore. He released the button. The apartment went quiet, except for the distant, muffled sound of Grant's voice still shouting into a dead intercom line downstairs, growing fainter as, presumably, building security escorted him from the lobby. I sat very still on the sofa, Josie asleep against my shoulder, and felt something strange move through me. Not triumph, not yet, but a kind of dazed relief, like watching a storm break against a house that, for once, had been built to withstand it. He'll try again, Marcus said, sitting back down across from me. Probably through his parents, or through some mutual friend he thinks will soften you up. Be ready for that. And Vivian? He paused, and for the first time that night, something almost gentle crept into his voice. I've known you since you were 6 years old, throwing a fit because your father wouldn't let you sit in on a board meeting. I want you to hear me say this plainly. Nothing that happened tonight was your fault. Not the labor, not the exhaustion, not any of it. You did nothing except survive childbirth and ask your husband to come home. Do not let him or anyone else convince you otherwise. I nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in my throat, and looked down at my daughter's small, sleeping face, utterly unaware of the war being waged around her in the first 3 days of her life. I did not sleep that night, not really. The kind of half-conscious drift that comes when your body is too exhausted to stay fully awake, but your mind refuses to let go. By 6 a.m., I was sitting at the kitchen island with a cup of coffee going cold in front of me. Josie in the bassinet Malcolm had helped me carry up from storage, when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. Vivian, it's Eleanor, Grant's mother. Please, can we talk? I had no idea about any of this, I promise you. I'm so sorry. I stared at the message for a long time before I showed it to Marcus, who read it twice, his mouth thinning into a line. Don't respond yet, he said. Could be genuine, could also be reconnaissance. Grant testing whether his mother can get through where he can't. Let me have Priyanka look into whether Eleanor Whitmore has spoken to him since last night. It took Priyanka less than 20 minutes to confirm what I already suspected in my gut. Eleanor and Grant's father, Harold, had left 3 voicemails on Grant's phone since 11 the previous night, and Grant had called his mother's cell at 2 in the morning for 11 minutes. Whatever Eleanor's text implied, it was not the message of a woman entirely in the dark. People will do a great deal to protect their children, Marcus said. Not unkindly, when I read him the call log. Even grown children who don't deserve it. I wouldn't assume malice on her part, but I also wouldn't assume innocence. By 8 a.m., the protective order had been filed. By 10, a judge, John, a woman named Constance Alvarez, whom Marcus described as no-nonsense in the best possible way, had granted the temporary order on an emergency basis, citing the newborn's welfare and what the filing termed a documented pattern of reckless disregard for the physical and emotional well-being of a postpartum mother. Grant was to remain 500 feet from me and Josie. A hearing on the longer-term custody and residence petitions was set for 3 weeks out. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt hollowed out, sitting in my enormous, silent kitchen with my newborn daughter, holding a piece of paper that legally separated me from the man I had married 18 months earlier, believing, with my whole exhausted, hopeful heart, that we would grow old together. It was Priya who finally broke through my numbness, arriving at noon with a bag of pastries from the bakery on Amsterdam we used to frequent in business school, and the particular ferocity of a best friend who has just learned her closest confidant spent her first night home from the hospital fighting a legal war instead of sleeping. I am going to kill him, she announced, dropping her bag on the counter and pulling me into a careful hug, mindful of the incision. Slowly, with my bare hands, in front of witnesses so it counts as a public service. Despite everything, I laughed. A real laugh, cracked and surprised, the first one in what felt like a very long time. Marcus already has a legal strategy, I said. I don't think murder is part of it. Fine, I'll settle for ruining his reputation so thoroughly he has to move to a different hemisphere. She pulled back to look at me properly, her dark eyes sharp with concern beneath the fury. Vivi, how are you, actually? I looked down at Josie, sleeping peacefully in her bassinet, oblivious to the fact that her father had, in the space of one dinner, become someone I no longer recognized. I don't know yet, I said honestly. Ask me in a week. 3 days later, Marcus asked to see me alone, without Priya, without my mother who had flown in from Geneva and installed herself in my guest room with the quiet, terrifying efficiency of a woman preparing for a siege. He sat across from me at the dining table, a slim folder in front of him, and I understood before he opened his mouth that whatever was inside it was going to hurt. We subpoenaed the financial records of Whitmore Strategies as part of discovery for the custody proceeding, he said. Standard procedure, given the questions around his income and assets. I want to walk you through what we found before you see it in any filing, because I think it's going to be difficult. Just tell me, I said. Whitmore Strategies has been operating at a significant loss for the past 14 months, Marcus said. Grant has been covering the shortfall with draws from your joint brokerage account, nearly $400,000 over that period, structured in amounts small enough to avoid triggering the reporting flags either of you might have noticed on a casual statement review. The number didn't fully register at first. I sat with it, turning it over, waiting for the shock to catch up to the words. $400,000, I repeated. That's the first thing. Marcus's voice was gentle but unhesitating, the voice of a man who had delivered worse news than this and knew that softening it further wouldn't help. The second thing is that in the past 6 weeks, 3 of those withdrawals were transferred to an account belonging to a woman named Simone Delacroix. I felt the floor tilt slightly beneath me. Who is that? She's a senior strategist at Voss Media, Marcus said, and watched my face carefully as the name landed. Voss Media. Devin Voss. My father's most aggressive competitor for the last decade. The man who had tried twice to acquire a controlling stake in Hale Media and Ventures and been rebuffed twice. The man whose name my father would not allow spoken at the dinner table. Vivian, Marcus said when I didn't respond, we don't yet know the full nature of the relationship. It could be a business consulting arrangement. It could be something else entirely. I need you to prepare yourself for either possibility. I thought of every late night over the past year that Grant had claimed a client dinner. Every weekend conference I hadn't been invited to. Every time he'd waved off a question about his schedule with that easy practice deflection. I thought of the way he'd pushed, gently but persistently over the last 6 months, for me to add him as a secondary contact on certain internal Hale communications. Just so I understand your world better, Viv, so I can support you. Requests I had declined every time, more out of habit and company policy than suspicion. I thought about how grateful I had felt, at the time, that he hadn't pushed harder. Find out, I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. All of it. I don't care how bad it is. I want to know exactly what my husband has been doing for the last year. Marcus nodded slowly. There's one more thing, he said. Priyanka pulled Whitmore Strategies' calendar records as part of the subpoena response. 6 weeks ago, the same week you told me you signed the title for the Aurora over into your name alone, as a surprise for yourself, Grant had a 2-hour meeting with a family law attorney named Feldman. Not our firm, not anyone we know, a specialist in high net worth prenuptial disputes. The room went very quiet. He was already planning this, I said slowly, understanding arriving in pieces, each one colder than the last. Before I even had her, before any of it. We don't know that for certain, Marcus said, but I would be doing you a disservice if I let you believe this began with a dinner reservation. I think, Vivian, that dinner reservation was a test. I think he wanted to see how far he could push and how you would respond before he made his next move. I sat with that for a long time, feeling something in my chest reorganize itself, not breaking further, but hardening, the way a bone knits stronger at the sight of an old fracture. 18 months of marriage, a daughter 3 days old, and somewhere in the last year, while I had been building a nursery and reading parenting books and trusting the man beside me completely, he had been quietly meeting with divorce attorneys and funneling money to a woman who worked for my father's fiercest rival. He wasn't just leaving me, I said finally. He was building a case against me, and he was doing it with Voss's money or Voss's help, or both. Marcus didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was very careful. That is what the evidence suggests. I'd like your permission to bring in a forensic accountant and to loop in your father's security team. If Grant has been sharing information about Hale Media internally, anything about the succession planning, the upcoming licensing negotiations, anything at all, this stops being a family matter and becomes something considerably larger. I looked down at my hands, folded on the table, and thought of Josie asleep in the next room, 3 weeks old now, entirely unaware that her existence had apparently been, for her father, simply the final piece of leverage in a plan that had started long before her first breath. Do it, I said. All of it. I want to know everything he's done, and I want to know it before he does. The 3 weeks between the temporary order and the full custody hearing passed in a strange, suspended fashion. Long enough for the raw shock of that first night to scar over into something more manageable. Short enough that I never stopped feeling like I was walking through a life that had been rearranged by someone else's hand while I wasn't looking. Grant tried to reach me twice more through intermediaries, once through his mother, who sent a long, apologetic email that Marcus advised me not to answer, and once through a mutual friend from our old apartment building who showed up at Priya's engagement party with a message he claimed Grant had just wanted her to hear directly. I declined to hear it. Marcus had been right. I was a black hole now, and every attempt at contact only strengthened the record we were building. The forensic accountant, a meticulous woman named Renata Cole, took 11 days to complete her preliminary report. What she found confirmed what Marcus had suspected and went further than either of us had feared. The withdrawals to Simone Delacroix's account totaled just over $200,000, structured as consulting fees for services Whitmore Strategies had never actually contracted. Cross-referencing the dates against Voss Media's public quarterly filings, Renata identified a pattern. Each transfer had occurred within days of a confidential Hale Media planning session that Grant, as my husband, had no formal access to, but had, apparently, learned about anyway, through overheard phone calls, through documents left open on my home office laptop, through a dozen small domestic intimacies I had never once imagined could be weaponized. None of it, Marcus was careful to explain, rose yet to a criminal standard. Grant had not, as far as the evidence showed, stolen documents or hacked any system. What he had done was subtler, and in its way, more devastating. He had married into proximity to information worth a great deal to the right competitor, and then sold pieces of that proximity, one conversation at a time, to a woman working for the one company my father would have done almost anything to keep at bay. The custody hearing itself was held in a plain, unglamorous courtroom in downtown Manhattan. Nothing like the marble and mahogany of the boardrooms where I usually did battle. Grant arrived with a new attorney, not Feldman, whom Marcus's team had already flagged in the filing as evidence of premeditation, but a slick, aggressive litigator named Corbin Hayes, whose opening argument attempted to paint the entire narrative as a wealthy family closing ranks against an outsider. My client made one poor decision on one difficult night, Hayes told Judge Alvarez, pacing in front of the bench with the easy confidence of a man who believed charm could substitute for facts. A new father, overwhelmed, made a mistake in judgment. He has been systematically frozen out of every aspect of his daughter's life since them, not because he poses any danger to her, but because his wife's family has the resources to make sure he never gets the chance to explain himself. For a moment, listening to him, I almost believed it myself. That was the unsettling gift of a good liar's version of events, the way it could make you doubt your own memory of your own life. Then Marcus rose, and in his flat, unhurried voice, walked the judge through the timeline. The meeting with Feldman 6 weeks before the birth, the pattern of withdrawals to Simone Delacroix beginning 8 months into the marriage, the calendar entries, the forensic accountant's report, and finally, the text messages and photographs from the night itself, time-stamped and screenshotted, showing a man eating scallops in soft restaurant lighting while his wife rode home from the hospital alone in a taxi. I watched Grant's face throughout, watched the charm try to hold, watched it begin, almost imperceptibly, to crack at the edges as the evidence piled up. When Judge Alvarez finally looked up from the file in front of her, her expression was not unkind, but it was final. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, "I have presided over a great many custody matters in this courtroom, and I want to be clear that a single poor decision made under the very real stress of new parenthood would not on its own concern me greatly. What concerns me is the pattern before me, evidence suggesting that decision was neither impulsive nor isolated, but part of a broader course of conduct that placed both the petitioner and the minor child at risk, financially and emotionally, well before the child was born." She granted Vivian primary physical custody with supervised visitation for Grant pending further evaluation and extended the order of protection through the full duration of the divorce proceedings. Grant sat very still as the ruling was read, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on some point on the table in front of him, and when the hearing ended, he did not look at me once as he was led out by his attorney. I should have felt victorious. Instead, walking out of that courtroom into the flat gray light of a Tuesday afternoon, I felt only exhausted, the particular exhaustion of a person who has just won a war they never wanted to fight, holding a daughter who would grow up someday and ask why her father wasn't in the pictures. I had naively believed the custody ruling might be the end of it, that Grant, faced with the plain weight of the evidence, might simply retreat, lick his wounds, and let the divorce proceed quietly through the courts like any other failed marriage among people with money and lawyers. I understood, within 2 weeks, exactly how naive that belief had been. It started with a single item in a gossip column that covered the city's wealthiest families with the breathless, faux intimate tone of someone who wanted readers to feel like insiders. "Trouble in the Hale-Whitmore household," the item read, as sources close to the couple describe a bitter custody battle following the birth of their daughter. Insiders whisper that media heiress Vivian Hale, known for her ruthless business instincts, may be bringing that same ruthlessness home, freezing her husband out of his own daughter's life with an army of family lawyers. I read it standing in my kitchen with Josie on my hip and felt something in me go very still and very cold. "It's Spin," Priya said when I called her. reading the item aloud with a rising note of disbelief in her voice. It's obviously spin. Anyone who knows you would see through it in a second. Not everyone knows me, I said. Most people reading this column know exactly one thing about me, that my last name is Hale and I run a division worth 9 figures. That's more than enough for a story like this to stick. Marcus, when I called him, was less alarmed but no less serious. This isn't accidental, he said. Someone fed that reporter a very specific narrative, with details about the custody filing that weren't part of any public record. That means either someone in the clerk's office or someone with direct access to Grant's side of the case.
Within a week, 2 more items appeared, each one slightly more pointed than the last, each one framing me, carefully, plausibly, in language just short of anything actionable, as a cold, controlling heiress punishing an ordinary man for the crime of marrying above his station. It was, I realized with a slow, sick understanding, a strategy. Not a legal one, but a public relations one, designed to pressure me through reputational damage where the courtroom evidence had failed. Voss Media owns 2 of the 3 outlets that ran these pieces, Renata Cole told me, during a call I'd asked her to join alongside Marcus. Not directly, through a holding structure, 3 layers removed, the kind of thing you'd need a forensic accountant to trace, but it's there. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the shape of the whole picture finally resolve into focus. This had never really been about Grant and me at all. Or rather, it had been about that, but it had also, from the very beginning, been a small skirmish in a much larger war between my father's company and Devin Voss's, with Grant as the willing, well-compensated instrument. What do we do? I asked. We don't respond in the press, Marcus said firmly. Not yet. Responding gives the story oxygen and makes you look defensive. What we do is document every leak, trace every source we can, and let it strengthen the case we're already building. If Voss Media is orchestrating a smear campaign timed to a custody dispute involving confidential information about Hale Media's operations, that's not just embarrassing for Grant. That's potentially actionable for him and possibly for Voss. My father, when I finally told him, I had been putting it off, some old instinct to protect him from worry even now, even after everything he'd already done to protect me, was quiet for a long moment on the phone. Vivian, he said finally, I want you to understand something. I did not raise you to hide from a fight because it became inconvenient or public. I raised you to win them. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I think so. Devin Voss has wanted a piece of this company since before you were running your own department, my father said. He tried twice to force a hostile position onto our board and failed twice. If he is now using your husband, your soon-to-be ex-husband, as a proxy to attack you personally in the hopes of destabilizing the succession plan everyone in this industry knows is coming, then he has made a serious miscalculation. Because you are not fragile, Vivian. You have never been fragile. You are simply, for the first time in your adult life, being tested in public instead of in a boardroom. Handle it exactly the way I taught you to handle everything else. I hung up the phone and looked down at Josie, 4 weeks old now, gumming contentedly at her own fist, entirely indifferent to the war her existence had, however unwillingly, become the center of. Okay, I said aloud, to no one and everyone. Okay. The email arrived on a Thursday evening, while I was sitting on the nursery floor watching Josie discover, with enormous delight, that her own toes existed. It came from an address I didn't recognize, but the subject line made my stomach drop before I'd even opened it. A private matter regarding your family. Inside was a single paragraph, cold and businesslike, the kind of message that had clearly been drafted and redrafted to sound calm rather than desperate.
though I could feel the desperation underneath it anyway. Vivian, I have documentation of internal Hale Media planning materials obtained during the course of our marriage that I have thus far declined to share with anyone, including opposing parties who have expressed considerable interest. I would prefer not to have to reconsider that position. I think a more reasonable custody arrangement and the restoration of my access to joint accounts would go a long way toward ensuring this remains a private family matter rather than a public and considerably more damaging one. I hope you'll think of Josie and of what's best for all of us before involving your lawyers further. Ah, G. I read it 3 times before I understood fully what I was looking at. Not a plea, not even really a threat in the traditional sense. It was, in its careful, lawyerly phrasing, an attempt at extortion, dressed up, as everything Grant did seemed to be dressed up, in the language of reasonableness and family. I forwarded it to Marcus without a word of commentary, my hands steady in a way that surprised me. He called back within 4 minutes. "Do not respond to this," he said, before I'd even said hello. "Do not acknowledge receipt. This is, on its face, an attempted extortion involving what may constitute misappropriated trade secrets. This changes the entire posture of the case, Vivian. This is no longer strictly a family court matter." "What does that mean?" "It means," Marcus said, "that I think it's time we brought in the District Attorney's Economic Crimes Unit. What Grant is describing in this email, documentation of confidential company planning materials obtained during your marriage being held as leverage, if true, and I suspect it is, given everything Renata's already found, that's a felony matter. Attempted extortion. Potentially wire fraud if any of those materials were transmitted electronically to Voss Media or its affiliates. Potentially trade secret theft under federal law." I sat very still on the nursery floor, Josie now fussing gently in my lap, and felt the last soft edges of the marriage I had once believed I was in finish dissolving into something harder and clearer. This was not a husband who had made one terrible choice on one terrible night. This was a man who had, methodically, and over the better part of a year, built a case for his own advantage out of the raw material of my trust, and who was now, cornered by the consequences of his own choices, attempting to threaten his way back into a position of power over me and our daughter. "Do it," I said. "Whatever needs to happen. I'm done being careful with him." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "There's one more thing you should know before I make that call," he said. "Detective work like this moves slowly and quietly at first. Surveillance, financial tracing, building a case that will actually hold up. It could be weeks, possibly longer, before anything becomes public or actionable. I need you to be prepared for that. And I need you to be prepared for the possibility that once this becomes a criminal matter, Grant may become considerably more desperate before he becomes any less dangerous." "I understand," I said, and found, to my own surprise, that I meant it without hesitation. Whatever fear I might once have felt at that warning had been slowly, steadily replaced over the past 6 weeks by something else entirely. Not recklessness, but resolve. The particular clear-eyed determination of a woman who has already survived the worst version of a thing she feared and discovered she was still standing. I looked down at my daughter, 6 weeks old now, her dark eyes, my father always said, fixed on my face with the total, uncomplicated trust of an infant who had no idea yet how complicated the adults around her had made everything. "We're going to be okay," I told her, and for the first time since that hospital room, I believed it completely. Not everything in those weeks was war. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell this story as nothing but courtrooms and legal pads and cold calculations. And that would leave out the parts that actually kept me upright. Josie learned to smile for real, not the gassy reflex of the first weeks, but a genuine, gummy, delighted grin on a Tuesday morning in early May while I was singing to her, badly, in the kitchen because it was the only thing that seemed to soothe her during the 6 a.m. feeding. I cried when it happened, the good kind of crying, the kind that doesn't need an explanation. My mother, who had extended her stay indefinitely without ever quite announcing that she was doing so, came in from the other room to see what the fuss was about and ended up crying too. The two of us standing in the kitchen at dawn, laughing and crying over a baby's first real smile, like it was the most important thing that had ever happened. Because in that moment, it was. My mother, Eleanor Hale, a different Eleanor than my mother-in-law, though I noted the coincidence with a kind of grim humor I didn't share with anyone, had spent most of her adult life as the quieter half of my parents' partnership. The one who managed the foundation, who hosted the dinners, who was underestimated constantly by men who mistook her gentleness for softness. Watching her in those weeks, I began to understand something about her I'd never fully appreciated as a child. That gentleness and strength were not opposites. That a person could hold a crying grandchild at 3 a.m. with one hand and coordinate a security briefing with the other. And that both of those things were simply what love looked like when it had somewhere real to go. "You're doing better than you think you are," she told me one evening, the two of us sitting on the terrace with a bottle of wine I wasn't yet cleared to drink, and she was drinking enough of for both of us, Josie finally asleep after a long, difficult evening. "I know it doesn't feel that way. I know some mornings you probably wake up and forget for half a second, and then remember, and it hits you all over again. That happened to me too, you know. Not with your father, but before him, there was someone else, a long time ago, someone I thought I would marry, who turned out to be considerably less than I believed he was." I looked at her, surprised. In 32 years, she had never once mentioned this. "What happened?" "I found out 3 weeks before the wedding that he'd been borrowing money from my own trust through a series of loans he never intended to repay to cover gambling debts he'd never mentioned," she said, matter of fact, though something old and faded moved behind her eyes. "Your grandfather handled it the way your father handled Grant, swiftly, thoroughly, without a shred of mercy. And I spent about 6 months afterward convinced I had been a fool, that I should have seen it coming, that some fundamental flaw in my judgment had let it happen." She turned to look at me. "It wasn't a flaw in my judgment, Vivian. It was a flaw in his character. Those are different things, and I want you to understand the difference before you spend one more sleepless night blaming yourself for something a grown man chose to do." I hadn't realized until she said it how much of my own private grief had been tangled up in exactly that question. Not just why did he do this, but what does it say about me that I didn't see it? Hearing her name it so plainly, so gently, loosened something in my chest that had been knotted tight since that first night in the hospital. "How did you get past it?" I asked. "I met your father 18 months later," she said, smiling faintly. "But that's not really the answer you're looking for, is it? The real answer is less romantic. I got past it by refusing to let one bad decision by one unworthy man become the entire story of my life. I built the foundation. I raised you and your brother. I became, eventually, someone whose worth had nothing whatsoever to do with whether some man from my 20s had been good enough to deserve me. That's the part that actually matters, Vivian, not the next relationship, the refusal to let the last one define you." I thought about that for a long time after she went to bed. Sitting alone on the terrace, with the city glittering below, Josie's monitor crackling faintly on the table beside me. I thought about Ether, No, not Ether, I corrected myself. That had been someone else's company, someone else's story. Mine was Hale Media. Mine was the digital publishing division I had built from nothing over the past 6 years into the company's fastest growing arm. Mine was a career I had built entirely on my own merit, despite, or perhaps because of, every assumption people made about heiresses who inherited rather than earned. I was not going to let Grant Whitmore become the whole story either. Detective Marisol Reyes of the District Attorney's Economic Crimes Unit was not at all what I expected when Marcus finally arranged a meeting 6 weeks after the blackmail email arrived. I had pictured someone hard-edged and impatient, and instead found a woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up into gray streaked hair who greeted me with a firm handshake and an economy of words that made me trust her immediately. "Your husband is not a criminal mastermind, Miss Hale," she told me, in the small conference room at the DA's office where Marcus and I had gone for what he described as a status update. I want to say that plainly because I think it matters for how you understand what's happened here. He's a man who got in over his head financially, made a series of increasingly desperate decisions, and is now trying to leverage what little he has left before it disappears entirely. That doesn't make what he did any less serious. It just means the shape of the case is different than you might expect. She explained in careful, measured detail what the investigation had uncovered. The $400,000 drawn from our joint accounts hadn't gone entirely to Simone Delacroix as I'd first believed. A substantial portion had gone toward covering Whitmore Strategies' mounting losses, and, more damningly, toward a series of increasingly risky personal investments Grant had made, without my knowledge, chasing returns to cover the shortfall he'd already created. When those investments had also failed, and with his consulting contracts terminated and his access to our joint accounts frozen, Grant had grown, in Reyes's assessment, financially desperate in a way that made him careless. 2 weeks ago, Reyes continued, one of Voss Media's own senior executives, not Simone Delacroix, someone above her, approached Whitmore about providing further internal Hale Media information considerably more sensitive than anything he'd shared before, in exchange for a substantial payment. What Whitmore didn't know is that this executive had, independently, become the subject of an unrelated federal investigation into securities fraud, and was already cooperating with authorities in exchange for leniency. Whitmore's approach, or rather, his response to being approached, was recorded as part of that ongoing investigation. I sat very still, absorbing this. He walked directly into a trap that had nothing to do with me. In a manner of speaking, Reyes said, though I'd note that the trap only caught him because he was already willing to be caught in it. A man with nothing to hide doesn't respond to an offer like that at all. She slid a folder across the table. We executed a search warrant on his current residence and his office 2 days ago. We recovered documentation confirming the extortion attempt against you, evidence of the information transfers to Simone Delacroix over the preceding year, and his communications with the cooperating Voss executive. Combined, we believe we have sufficient grounds for charges of wire fraud, attempted extortion, and misappropriation of trade secrets. When? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. We're prepared to move within the week, Reyes said. I wanted you to hear it from me directly, before it happens, so you're not blindsided by the news. There will very likely be press interest, given the parties involved. I'd recommend you have a statement prepared, though I'd also recommend saying as little as possible publicly until the process plays out. Marcus beside me was already making notes, already 3 steps ahead into the practical logistics of what would come next. The press strategy, the custody implications, the divorce proceedings that would now unfold under an entirely different shadow. I sat and let the news settle over me slowly, layer by layer, the way snow settles rather than falls. the man I had married, the father of my daughter. About to be arrested for wire fraud and extortion, undone not by my father's considerable resources or Marcus's careful legal maneuvering, but by his own desperate, careless attempt to squeeze one more advantage out of a situation that had already, months earlier, stopped being winnable. "There's an irony in it," Reyes said, almost gently, watching my face. "The man who tried to leverage insider information against your family ended up caught by an entirely unrelated federal case, brought down by his own greed rather than anyone's revenge. Sometimes that's how it goes. The universe doesn't usually hand out poetic justice this cleanly, but every so often, it does." I thought of Josie, 10 weeks old now, currently at home with my mother, blissfully unaware that the man whose face she would someday see in old photographs was about to become, formally and publicly, a criminal. "Thank you for telling me first," I said to Reyes, and found that I meant it, even through the strange, numb static of the moment. "Whatever happens next, thank you." They took him on a Wednesday morning, outside the temporary corporate apartment his parents had arranged for him after he'd been forced out of our old building. I wasn't there. I learned about it the way most of the city did, through a 2-line breaking news alert that buzzed on my phone while I was in a meeting with my own executive team discussing licensing terms for a documentary series my division had spent 8 months developing. Grant Whitmore, husband of media heiress Vivian Hale, arrested on federal charges including wire fraud and extortion. I excused myself from the meeting, walked to the small private office adjoining the conference room, and sat down very carefully in the chair behind the desk, staring at the notification until the words stopped looking like words and became just shapes on a screen. Marcus called 10 minutes later, before I'd even had time to process what I was feeling. Grief, I realized eventually, though not for the marriage. I had already grieved that, in stages, over the preceding 2 months. This grief was smaller and stranger, something closer to mourning the version of Grant I had believed I married, the version that had perhaps never fully existed at all, or had existed only briefly, before ambition and resentment and some fracture I would probably never fully understand had worn it away. "He's in custody," Marcus confirmed. "Bail hearing is set for tomorrow morning. Given the flight risk factors and the severity of the charges, I'd expect the prosecution to push hard against release, or, at minimum, for a substantial bond with significant restrictions." "His parents?" I asked. "Devastated, from what I understand. Eleanor Whitmore has retained separate counsel, though I don't believe it's for Grant's defense. I think she may be exploring her own legal exposure, given the calls between them that Priyanka flagged early on. Whether she knew the full extent of what he was doing, I genuinely don't know. I suspect even she doesn't fully know yet." I thought of Eleanor's text that first morning. I had no idea about any of this, I promise you, and wondered, not for the first time, how much truth and how much self-protection had been tangled together in those words. I would probably never know for certain. Some questions, I was learning, simply didn't get clean answers, and a person had to find a way to live inside that uncertainty rather than waiting for it to resolve. The supervised visitation order, already tenuous, was suspended pending the outcome of the criminal case. A formality, really, since a man facing federal fraud charges and unable to make bail without significant restrictions was in no position to exercise visitation of any kind. I signed the paperwork that afternoon with a steadiness that surprised me. A pen moving across a page to formally, legally, sever the last thread connecting Grant Whitmore to any active role in our daughter's daily life. That evening, back at the penthouse, I fed Josie her bottle in the quiet of the nursery, the city lights sprawling gold and silver beyond the window, and found that the tension I'd been carrying in my shoulders for 2 months, a tightness so constant I'd nearly forgotten what it felt like to be without it, had finally quietly begun to release. The war, or at least this chapter of it, was over. I picked up my phone and called my father. "Daddy?" I said when he answered. "It's done. Marcus told you?" "He did," my father said, and I could hear, beneath the familiar steadiness of his voice, something that might have been relief, or might have been pride, or might, knowing him, have been both at once. "How are you, Vivian? Truly." I looked down at Josie, drowsy now against my arm, her small hand curled around my finger with the same absolute trust she'd had since the day she was born, unaltered by everything that had happened around her. "I think," I said slowly, testing the words as I said them, "that I'm going to be all right. Better than all right, eventually. I just need to figure out what that looks like now." "You will," my father said. "You always do. Now, there's something I've been wanting to discuss with you. When you're ready, not tonight, but soon. Something about the future of this company and where you fit into it." My father made good on his word 10 days later, arriving at the penthouse unannounced on a Sunday afternoon with my mother in tow, both of them dressed with the particular formality they reserved for conversations they considered important. I knew, the moment I saw them standing in my doorway, that whatever this was, it was not casual. We settled in the living room, Josie napping in her bassinet nearby, and my father, a man who rarely wasted words on preamble in business matters, however carefully he cushioned them in family ones, got, eventually, to the point. "I'm 68 years old, Vivian," he said. "I built this company from a single failing newspaper my own father nearly ran into the ground, into something that spans 4 continents and employs 11,000 people. I have spent the last decade thinking carefully about who comes after me, and I want to tell you plainly, it has always been you. Not because you're my daughter, because you are, without question, the most capable executive in this company. And I have watched you prove that for 6 years, running your own division, while half the board assumed you'd been handed it." I felt something tighten in my chest. Not quite surprise, since some part of me had always known this conversation was coming eventually, but something adjacent to it. A recognition that eventually had, apparently, arrived. "The board has been pushing for a formal succession announcement for over a year," my father continued. "I've held off, in part because I wanted you to come to it on your own terms rather than mine, and in part, I'll admit, because I wasn't certain the timing was ever going to feel right. Recent events have made it clear to me that there is no such thing as a perfect moment to make this decision. There is only the moment you're actually in, and what you choose to do with it." "You want me to take over the company," I said slowly. "Now, while I'm 3 months postpartum and in the middle of a federal criminal case involving my husband?" "I want you to take over the company," my father said, "because you are exactly the person this company needs, and because I have watched you handle the last 3 months with more grace and strategic clarity than most executives I've worked with in 40 years handle a difficult quarter. I am not offering you this because I feel sorry for you, Vivian. I would never insult you that way. I am offering it to you because you have earned it, and because the timing, as difficult as it's been, has only proven the point." My mother, quiet until now, leaned forward. "You don't have to decide today," she said gently, "but I want you to know you can run both, your division and the company. Others have done it, women who carried far more than you're carrying right now. It requires a different kind of strength than the strength you've used these last 3 months. Not the strength to fight a single battle, but the strength to sustain a long campaign. We believe you have it, but the decision has to be yours." I sat with it for a long moment, looking around the living room that had once felt, in the darkest weeks after that hospital night, like a gilded cage, beautiful, expensive, and utterly hollow. I thought of the years I'd spent trying to build my own identity within the shadow of the Hale name, proving through my digital division's numbers, quarter after quarter, that I deserved my seat at the table on my own merits and not merely my birthright. And now, here was that same shadow, offering not to diminish me, but to hand me the entire mantle. Not a cage this time, but something closer to a crown, if I was willing to carry its weight. I need to think, I said finally. Hale Media is important to me. My division is my work, my legacy in its own right. I want to make sure that whatever this looks like, I'm not losing myself inside it. Take the time you need, my father said. But know that whatever you decide, I am proud of you. I would have been proud of you regardless of any of this. But watching you handle what's happened these last 3 months, I don't think I've ever been more certain of anything in my life than I am that this company will be in extraordinary hands when I finally step back. I spent the following week turning my father's offer over in my mind the way I imagined a jeweler turns a diamond, looking for flaws from every angle before deciding whether it was truly as flawless as it appeared. I met Priya for lunch at a quiet, members-only club near her office, the kind of place where the tablecloths were heavier than they needed to be, and the conversations at neighboring tables were conducted in the careful murmur of people accustomed to being overheard by nobody who mattered. "You're going to say yes," Priya said before I'd even finished explaining the offer, stirring her iced tea with the particular confidence of a woman who had known me since we were 22 years old and terrified of our first internships. "I haven't decided anything." "You have," she said. "You just haven't admitted it to yourself yet, because admitting it means admitting how much you've changed in the last 3 months, and some part of you is still grieving the version of your life where you didn't have to change at all." She set down her spoon and looked at me with the particular directness only a decade and a half of friendship could earn. "Vivi, I watched you build your division from a passion project the board barely tolerated into the fastest-growing arm of the entire company. I watched you survive childbirth, a husband's betrayal, a smear campaign, an extortion attempt, and a federal arrest, all in the space of 3 months, without once losing your composure in public. You are not the same woman who walked into that hospital room in January. You're someone considerably more formidable. I think some part of you already knows that the company deserves that version of you, and so do you." I picked at my salad, unable to argue with any of it, though something in me still resisted the finality of the decision. "I'm scared," I admitted, "that if I say yes, I'll lose the parts of myself that had nothing to do with the Hale name, the division I built myself, the version of my life that felt like it was mine and not just an inheritance." "Then don't lose them," Priya said simply. "Negotiate it. You've spent 3 months negotiating with lawyers, judges, and federal prosecutors. I think you can negotiate with your own father," she smiled, softening. "For what it's worth, and I know you didn't ask, but I'm going to tell you anyway because that's what I'm here for, I think the version of you that survived this year is exactly the version this company needs at the top of it. Not despite everything that happened, because of how you handled it." I thought about that conversation for the rest of the afternoon, walking home through the park with Josie asleep in her stroller, the early summer light warm and golden through the trees. By the time I reached the apartment, I had, without quite noticing the moment it happened, made my decision. Not the decision itself, exactly, which I'd perhaps known since the moment my father first raised it, but the terms on which I was willing to accept it. I called him that evening. "Daddy," I said when he answered. "I'll do it, but I have 2 conditions." I could hear the smile in his voice before he even spoke. "Name them." "First," I said, "I want to merge the succession with a new initiative. I want the Hale Foundation and a new foundation I'm establishing in Josie's name to sit at the core of the company's public identity going forward. Not as a sidebar, not as a corporate responsibility footnote, but as the headline. We're not just building revenue, we're building something that outlasts us. A pause, considering. That's an ambitious repositioning. Bold in some quarters. I like it. Second, I said, you don't retire in 18 months and disappear to Geneva permanently. You become chairman emeritus. I become CEO. But you stay on the board as my advisor. Not because I'm not capable of running this company, but because I respect everything you built here, and I'm not interested in pretending I can absorb 40 years of your judgment overnight. I want your counsel for as long as you're willing to give it. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that for a moment I wondered if the call had dropped. When my father finally spoke, his voice was thick with something I heard from him only rarely. Not pride exactly, or not only pride, but something closer to a kind of vindication, the particular satisfaction of a man watching a lifetime of quiet faith finally, fully justified. You have a deal, he said. You'll have my counsel for as long as you want it, but make no mistake, Vivian, it will be your company, your empire to build however you see fit. After we hung up, I sat for a long time in the quiet of the living room, looking out at the city lights, and felt something settle into place inside me that had been unsettled since that first terrible night in the hospital. Not closure, exactly, because I don't think grief and betrayal ever fully close, but something adjacent to it. A sense of direction. A sense that whatever had been taken from me in that hospital room had, somehow, in the strange arithmetic of survival, been replaced by something I would never have chosen, but had, in the end, made me. I had not expected to hear from Devin Voss directly. I had expected, if anything, a continued campaign of proxies and plausible deniability, more leaks to friendly gossip columns, more carefully laundered pressure applied through channels that would never trace cleanly back to him. Instead, 3 weeks after my father's succession offer, I received a handwritten note, delivered by courier to my office, requesting a meeting at your convenience and entirely off the record. Marcus advised against it. My father, when I told him, was more measured. Voss is many things, he said, but he's rarely stupid. If he wants a meeting now, it's because he's calculating that the criminal case against your husband exposes him to real risk, and he wants to manage that risk directly, rather than through lawyers. Meet him if you want to, but record everything, and tell no one what you intend to say before you say it. I met him on a Thursday afternoon at a discreet private dining room above one of the city's oldest steakhouses, a place my father had taken me to as a teenager for what he'd called an education in how men like this operate. Devin Voss was older than I expected. I had built him up, in my mind, into something closer to a cartoon villain over the preceding months, and the reality was an ordinary-looking man in his 60s, silver-haired, tired around the eyes in a way that suggested the last several months had not been kind to him either. Miss Hale, he said, rising as I entered, extending a hand I did not take. He didn't seem surprised. Thank you for coming. I'm here to listen, I said, taking a seat across from him without preamble. Not to negotiate anything. I want to be clear about that before you say a word. Fair enough? He sat, folding his hands on the table with the particular composure of a man used to controlling rooms, though I noted with some satisfaction that his composure seemed to be costing him more effort than it once might have. I want to say first that I did not orchestrate what happened between you and your husband. I want that understood clearly. What I did was considerably more passive, and I want to own that honestly, because I think honesty is the only currency that still means anything between us at this point. Simone Delacroix approached me 18 months ago with information suggesting a Hale Media executive's spouse might be a useful, discreet source of competitive intelligence. I authorized her to pursue it. I did not ask and did not particularly want to know the details of how she went about doing so. "You're telling me you enabled it," I said, "and then looked away so you could claim ignorance later." "I'm telling you the truth," Voss said, "which is uglier than a clean denial, but which I suspect you'll trust more than a clean denial would deserve. I have spent 30 years building a company in the shadow of yours, Miss Hale, always the second largest, always the one written about as the also ran in every industry retrospective. I let my ambition get ahead of my judgment. I am telling you this because my own legal counsel has advised me that the ongoing federal investigation into my company's dealings with Mr. Whitmore, and separately with the executive currently cooperating with authorities, creates exposure I would like to resolve as cleanly as possible, for my company's sake and, I'll admit, for my own." "You want me to intervene," I said flatly, "to ask the prosecutors to go easy on Voss Media in exchange for what exactly? An apology?" "I want nothing from you that isn't already yours to give freely, or not," Voss said. "I came here because I believe you deserve to hear this directly from me rather than through lawyers and leaked columns, and because I think, and you can take this for whatever it's worth from a man you have every reason to distrust, that you handled these last several months with more integrity than I have managed to muster in 30 years of business. I am not asking you for mercy. I am telling you that whatever happens to my company as a result of this, I understand that I earned it." I sat with that for a long moment, studying his face, looking for the manipulation I was certain must be underneath it somewhere, and found, to my own surprise, that I couldn't locate it, or if it was there, it was buried under something that looked, uncomfortably, like genuine regret. "I'm not going to intervene with the prosecutors," I said finally, rising from my seat. "Not because I want to punish you further than the law already will, but because I've spent the last 4 months learning that the people who deserve mercy are the ones who ask for it honestly, without trying to extract something in exchange for it. You've been honest with me today, Mr. Voss. I respect that more than I expected to. But I'm done making exceptions for men who use other people as instruments and then come looking for absolution once the instrument breaks in their hands." I left him sitting alone at the table and walked out into the late afternoon light feeling, for the first time in longer than I could remember, entirely and uncomplicatedly like myself. Grant's case never went to trial. His attorney, Corbin Hayes, negotiated a plea agreement 4 months after the arrest, a decision Marcus explained was less about strategy than about the sheer weight of evidence Detective Reyes's team had assembled, evidence that made a trial a near certain loss, and a plea the only path to a sentence that didn't stretch into decades. I attended the plea hearing, though Marcus had told me I wasn't required to, and I hadn't been entirely sure, in the days leading up to it, why I felt so strongly that I needed to be there. It wasn't for Grant's sake. Sitting in the gallery of that courtroom, watching him stand beside Hayes in an ill-fitting gray suit that had clearly been borrowed or hastily purchased, I felt none of the visceral anger that had carried me through the previous months. What I felt, mostly, was a kind of distant, clinical sadness, the particular grief of watching someone you once loved reveal themselves to be considerably smaller than the person you'd believed you married. He pleaded guilty to charges of wire fraud and attempted extortion, the trade secrets charge reduced as part of the agreement in exchange for his cooperation in the broader investigation into Voss Media's practices. The judge, not Alvarez, a different judge entirely in a different courtroom in the strange bureaucratic sprawl of the federal system, set sentencing for 8 weeks later and released him on a modest bond pending that date, with conditions that included surrendering his passport and remaining within the district. Grant looked at me exactly once during the proceeding as he was being led back to the defense table after entering his plea. Our eyes met across the courtroom, and I braced myself for, I wasn't entirely sure what. Anger, maybe. Some final attempt at charm. Some last performance meant to soften what he'd become in my eyes. Instead, what I saw on his face was something I hadn't expected at all. Shame. Plain and unguarded. The first entirely honest expression I could remember seeing from him since the day he'd proposed. He didn't try to speak to me. He simply held my gaze for a moment, something passing between us that felt, for the first time in a year, unrehearsed. And then Hayes touched his elbow, and he looked away, and the moment closed. I left the courthouse that afternoon and walked, rather than taking a car, the whole way home through streets thick with the ordinary business of a city that had no idea what had just happened inside that building, and found that I was crying, not for the marriage, which I had long since finished grieving, but for something harder to name. For the daughter who would grow up asking questions I wouldn't have easy answers to. For the 18 months I had genuinely, wholeheartedly loved a man who had, apparently, spent much of that time already calculating his exit. For the particular loneliness of discovering that grief doesn't always look like sadness. Sometimes it looks like relief, and the guilt of feeling relieved can be its own kind of heavy. Sentencing, 8 weeks later, came down to 7 years in federal prison, with the possibility of reduced time for good behavior and the cooperation he'd already provided. Eleanor and Harold Whitmore sat in the front row throughout, Eleanor's face streaked with silent tears, Harold's jaw set in the particular rigid stillness of a man determined not to break down in public. I did not attend the sentencing. I had said what I needed to say to that courtroom already, and I understood, by then, that whatever came next for Grant was no longer mine to carry. That evening, I sat with Josie in the nursery, 5 months old now and endlessly curious about everything, reaching for my face, my hair, the mobile spinning slowly overhead, and felt something in me finally, fully exhale. "It's over," I told her, though she couldn't understand a word of it yet, though she would grow up someday needing a far more careful, age-appropriate version of this story than the one I could tell tonight. Whatever else happens, that part is over. In the months that followed, I threw myself into work with an intensity that Priya gently teased me about, and my mother watched with quiet, careful concern, checking in often enough that I understood she was making sure I wasn't simply running from grief by drowning myself in spreadsheets and board meetings. She wasn't entirely wrong to worry, but I also knew, better than anyone could tell me, that building something was exactly what I needed, not as an escape from what had happened, but as proof, to myself as much as anyone, that I was more than the worst chapter of my own story. The formal succession announcement came in September, 6 months after that terrible night in the hospital. In a press release my own communications team drafted with unusual care. Vivian Hale, currently president of Hale Digital Media, will assume the role of Chief Executive Officer of Hale Media and Ventures, effective January 1st, with Robert Hale transitioning to Chairman Emeritus. The coverage, predictably, could not resist mentioning the criminal case that had unfolded in parallel over the preceding months. But I noticed, with some satisfaction, that the tone had shifted considerably from those early gossip column items. The narrative that emerged instead, gradually, through interviews and profiles and the simple accumulation of public fact, was of a woman who had survived a genuinely brutal year and emerged not diminished but sharpened, ready to run one of the largest media companies in the country. Alongside the succession announcement, I filed the founding paperwork for the Josephine Hale Foundation, dedicated to supporting mothers and infants in the vulnerable weeks surrounding childbirth, postpartum health clinics in underserved neighborhoods, emergency housing assistance for new mothers escaping unsafe situations, job training programs designed around the realities of caring for a newborn rather than against them. I wrote the first check myself, $5 million, not from any trust or corporate account, but from my own earnings, the ones that had nothing to do with the Hale name and everything to do with the division I'd built with my own hands over 6 years. Renata Cole, whose forensic work had unraveled Grant's financial deceptions, agreed to join the foundation's board as its first outside director, a choice that raised a few eyebrows in the press but felt to me like the correct symbolic close to that particular chapter. The woman whose careful, unglamorous diligence had exposed the truth, now helping to build something meaningful out of its wreckage. "You know," Priya said one evening in late autumn, the two of us sitting on my terrace with Josie, nearly 7 months old now, sturdy and curious and increasingly hilariously opinionated about everything, babbling happily between us. "A year ago, if you told me you'd end up running the entire company and launching a foundation in the same year you survived a federal fraud case involving your own husband, I would have said you were describing the plot of an absurd movie." "A year ago," I said, "I would have agreed with you." "Do you regret it?" she asked, more seriously than her tone a moment before had suggested. "Any of it. Marrying him, I mean. If you could go back." I considered the question honestly, turning it over the way I'd learned to turn over difficult things in the preceding months, looking for the truest answer rather than the easiest one. "No," I said finally. "Not really. I regret what he did, and what it cost. But I don't regret the 18 months I loved him, because I loved him honestly, even if he never returned the favor in kind. And I certainly don't regret her." I looked down at Josie, who had, at that exact moment, discovered she could make an enormously satisfying noise by slapping her palm flat against the terrace tiles, and was doing so with tremendous, delighted enthusiasm. Whatever else came out of that marriage, she's the part that actually matters. Everything else was just the price of getting to her. Priya reached over and squeezed my hand, and we sat together in the cooling autumn air, watching my daughter discover the world one delighted slap of her palm at a time. And I understood, more fully than I had at any point in the preceding year, that I had not simply survived something terrible. I had, somehow, in the strange and unpredictable arithmetic of a life interrupted, built something genuinely good out of the wreckage of it. The request came from a journalist at one of the country's most respected business magazines, a woman named Diane Okafor, who had built a reputation over 2 decades for profiles that managed to be both rigorous and humane. The rare kind of business journalism that treated its subjects as full people rather than case studies. My communications team had been fielding interview requests for months. Everyone wanted the story, the scandal, the fall and rise, told in the breathless language of tabloid drama. And I had declined every single one, unwilling to hand my life over to a narrative I hadn't shaped myself. Diane's request was different. She didn't ask for the scandal. She asked, in a handwritten note remarkably similar in its restraint to the one Devin Voss had sent me months earlier, whether I would be willing to discuss how a leader rebuilds not just a company, but herself in the aftermath of a genuinely public unraveling. I said yes. We met in my office on a gray November afternoon. Josie's photograph on my desk alongside a small, framed print of the front page of the very first newspaper my great-grandfather had ever published, the one my father had given me the day I officially became CEO. Diane was sharp and unhurried, asking questions that circled the truth patiently rather than lunging for it. And somewhere in the second hour of our conversation, I found myself saying things I hadn't fully articulated even to myself. People keep asking me if I feel vindicated, I told her. As if vindication is the emotion at the center of all this. It isn't. What I feel, mostly, is grateful. Not for what happened, which was genuinely awful, but for the fact that I had resources most people in my situation don't have. A father who could mobilize a legal team within an hour. Attorneys who could freeze accounts overnight. A company large enough to weather a scandal without collapsing. I think about the mothers who go through some version of what I went through. Abandoned, financially vulnerable, 3 days postpartum, and utterly alone, without any of that. That's actually the entire reason the foundation exists. Because I know, better than most people in my position ever let themselves admit, how much of my recovery was privilege rather than resilience. That's an unusually honest answer for someone in your position, Diane said. I've had a year of being unusually honest, whether I wanted to be or not, I said. The court filings, the press coverage, the federal case, none of it left much room for polish. At a certain point, I decided the only way through it was to stop pretending I had more control over the narrative than I actually did, and just tell the truth as clearly as I could. She asked, eventually, the question I'd known was coming from the moment I agreed to the interview. How do you talk to your daughter, someday, about her father? I thought about that for a long moment before I answered. Not because I hadn't considered it before, but because I wanted to give her, and eventually Josie, the truest version I had. Honestly, I said finally, and in pieces, as she's old enough to understand each piece. I'll tell her that her father made choices that hurt people, including her, and that those choices had real consequences. I'll also tell her that he loved her, in whatever limited way he was capable of loving anyone, and that both of those things can be true at once. That people are rarely simply villains or simply victims. That most of us are some complicated, unfinished mixture of both. I don't want her to grow up believing her existence was a mistake, or that she came from nothing but betrayal. She came from a lot of love too, even if it turned out to be more fragile than I understood at the time. I want her to know all of it, eventually. I just don't think a 5-year-old needs the federal case number. Diane laughed, softly, and I saw something shift in her expression. Not quite surprise, but the particular recognition of a journalist who has found, unexpectedly, the actual story underneath the one she'd come looking for. For what it's worth, she said, closing her notebook, I think that's exactly the right answer. The profile ran 3 weeks later under the headline, The Reluctant Empire, How Vivian Hale Rebuilt a Company, a Family, and Herself all at once. And for the first time since that terrible night in the hospital, I read a piece about my own life and recognized, in every line of it, someone I was actually proud to be. It arrived in March, almost exactly 1 year after the night that changed everything, forwarded through Marcus's office with a note attached explaining that it had come from the federal correctional facility where Grant was serving his sentence, and that Marcus had reviewed it and found nothing in it that violated the terms of the protective order, which had been modified, at my request, to allow written correspondence only, screened first by counsel. I almost didn't read it. I sat with the sealed envelope on my desk for 3 days before I finally opened it, on a quiet Sunday evening after Josie had gone to sleep, needing, I think, to be entirely alone and entirely steady before I let his handwriting back into my life in any form. Vivian, I don't expect you to read this, and I understand if you don't. I'm not writing to ask for anything. Not forgiveness, not a reduced sentence, not a place back in Josie's life before she's old enough to decide for herself whether she wants one. I'm writing because I've had a great deal of time to think, in here, about who I was in that hospital room. And I think I owe you the truth, even if it comes a year too late to matter. I don't fully understand, even now, why I did what I did. I've spent months in therapy here, mandatory, but I've come to find it useful anyway, trying to untangle it. And the honest answer is that I let resentment I never dealt with curdle into something much worse than resentment. I resented being seen as an accessory to your name, long before I ever resented you specifically. And instead of talking to you about it, the way an adult in a real partnership would have, I let it become a justification for choices that had nothing to do with resentment and everything to do with greed and cowardice. The dinner. The affair, because that's what it was, whatever I told myself at the time. The information I gave Simone. The email I sent you, which I am more ashamed of than anything else I've ever done, because threatening the mother of my own child is not something I can find any version of myself capable of forgiving. I am not asking you to tell Josie anything good about me. I don't think I've earned that yet, and I'm not certain I ever will. What I am asking, if you're willing, is that someday, not now, not soon, whenever you judge it right, you tell her that I was sorry. Not as an excuse, just as a fact. I was sorry, eventually, even if it took prison and therapy and losing everything to get me there. I hope she's well. I hope you're well. I know I have no right to hope for either of those things, but I find I can't quite stop myself from doing it anyway. Grant. I sat with the letter for a long time after I finished it, feeling something complicated move through me. Not forgiveness, not yet, and maybe not ever fully, but something adjacent to it. A kind of weary, unglamorous acknowledgement that the man who had written those words was, apparently, capable of a self-honesty I hadn't seen from him even once during our marriage. It didn't erase anything. It didn't undo the taxi ride home, or the frozen accounts, or the extortion email, or the year of quiet betrayal that had preceded all of it. But it gave me something I hadn't realized I needed until I had it. Proof that the version of him capable of remorse, however late, however insufficient, had been real, buried somewhere under everything else. I did not write back. I filed the letter in a drawer in my office, alongside the divorce decree and the custody order and the small stack of documents that made up the official record of that year, and decided that someday, when Josie was old enough to ask the questions I knew she eventually would tell her about this letter too. Not to redeem him, but because I had promised myself, on that terrace with my mother, that I would give my daughter the whole truth, in pieces, as she was ready for each one. This letter was part of the truth. It deserved its place in the record, however small. The first annual Josephine Hale Foundation Gala was held that June at the Metropolitan Museum, a fusion of old New York philanthropy and new money energy that my events team had spent 4 months orchestrating with the precision of a military campaign. I stood backstage in a gown that had been chosen with unusual care, elegant but severe, structured in a way that felt more like armor than adornment, and looked out through a gap in the curtain at a room glittering with the particular density of wealth and influence that only a truly significant cause could gather in one place. Josie, 11 months old now, cheerful and increasingly mobile and utterly indifferent to the significance of the evening, was upstairs in a private suite with her nanny, occasionally audible over the baby monitor clipped to my wrist, babbling contentedly at a stuffed rabbit that had become, in recent weeks, her most treasured possession. My parents watched from the front table as I walked to the podium, my father in a tuxedo that had fit him, I suspected, for at least 20 years, my mother in a deep emerald gown that made her look, as it always did, like she'd stepped directly out of some earlier, more elegant decade. My father gave me a small nod as I passed, barely perceptible to anyone who didn't know him well enough to read it. But I caught it and felt something steady settle into my chest. I did not need notes. I had written and rewritten the speech a dozen times in the preceding weeks, but standing at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, some genuinely moved, some merely curious, all of them there, in one way or another, to see the woman who had survived a scandal loud enough to fill a year of headlines and somehow emerged running one of the largest media companies in the country. I found that I didn't need to consult a single page. "Thank you all for being here tonight," I began, my voice carrying clean and steady through the hushed hall. "We're here to talk about the future, not the speculative future of markets or technology, which is what most of the rooms I sit in are usually discussing, but the immediate, tangible future of real lives, specifically the lives of mothers and infants who find themselves, often through no fault of their own, at the most vulnerable crossroads a person can face." I spoke, without naming myself directly, about isolation, the particular crushing isolation of a woman left alone with a newborn and no support, no resources, no army of lawyers to call at midnight. I spoke about the mothers the foundation existed to serve, women without a single one of the advantages I'd had, women for whom a partner's abandonment meant not merely heartbreak, but genuine, immediate danger. No home, no income, no safety net beneath them at all. I did not tell my own story explicitly. I didn't need to. It hung in the room anyway, a shape everyone present could recognize, unspoken and entirely understood. I announced the Foundation's first major grants: postpartum health clinics in 3 underserved boroughs, a legal aid partnership providing free emergency representation to mothers facing custody disputes without resources to hire counsel of their own, a housing assistance program designed specifically around the realities of new motherhood rather than against them. The applause, when it came, was long and genuine, the particular warmth of a room that understood it had just witnessed something real rather than merely performative. Afterward, working the room with a glass of sparkling water I was in no danger of finishing, I found myself approached by a well-known media commentator, champagne glass in hand, his tone carrying the faint, condescending edge of a man unaccustomed to being impressed by anyone younger than himself. "Quite a pivot, Miss Hale," he said. "From corporate media to charity. A noble way to rehabilitate an image, I suppose." I smiled. The cool, polished smile I had spent the last year perfecting in courtrooms and boardrooms, and now, apparently, at galas as well. "It's not a pivot," I said. "It's an expansion. Hale Media builds the platforms that shape culture. The Foundation builds the people who deserve a fair chance to shape it alongside us. Philanthropy, done with real focus rather than as a tax strategy, isn't an expense. It's the single best investment I've ever made in the long-term stability of everything else I run." I let the smile widen, just slightly. "You should consider it, Charles. There's real return in it, if you're willing to look past the optics." I watched his condescension falter, then fade entirely, and excused myself before he could recover a response. Later, on the terrace overlooking the museum's lit fountains, I found a rare moment alone. Priya joined me, handing me a fresh glass of water, her own champagne mostly gone. "You didn't just host a gala tonight," she said. "You hosted a coronation." I laughed, leaning against the railing, looking out at the city that had witnessed the very worst night of my life exactly 1 year earlier, now, spread out below me, glittering and vast, and, for the first time in longer than I could clearly remember, entirely mine to shape however I chose. Josie is 4 years old as I write this, though I suspect by the time she's old enough to read it herself, she'll be considerably older than that. Old enough to ask the questions I've spent years preparing careful, age-appropriate answers for. She knows, in the simple way a 4-year-old understands anything, that her father lives far away and that she doesn't see him, and she has, so far, accepted this the way children accept most facts about their own lives, as simply the shape of things, without the freight of grief or judgment that an adult would attach to the same information. I think about that hospital room often, more often than I expected I would, given how far my life has traveled from it since. I think about the version of myself who sat there holding my 3-day-old daughter, watching my husband smooth his shirt and check his watch, still believing in some small, hopeful corner of my mind that this was a misunderstanding rather than a revelation. I don't regret that version of myself. I think she deserves more grace than the world tends to offer women in her position. Women who trust, who hope, who choose to believe the best of the people they love, right up until the evidence makes that belief impossible to sustain any longer. That isn't naivety. That's the ordinary, decent optimism required to build a life with another person in the first place. And I refuse to let anyone, including some harsher version of myself looking backward, turn it into a character flaw. Grant is due for release in just under 2 years now. His sentence reduced somewhat for good behavior and continued cooperation with the ongoing investigation into Voss Media, which ultimately resulted in a substantial civil settlement and a formal restructuring of the company's leadership. Devin Voss himself stepping down from his role as CEO, 6 months after our conversation above that steakhouse, though he was never criminally charged. I don't know, yet, what role Grant will want to play in Josie's life once he's released, or what role a court will allow him to play, or what role I'll be able to bring myself to permit. I've decided not to answer that question until I actually have to. Some things, I've learned, don't benefit from being solved in advance. They simply have to be lived through, one decision at a time, when the moment for the decision actually arrives. What I know for certain is this. Josie will grow up knowing she is loved completely by me, by my parents, by Priya, who has become something between an aunt and a second mother to her, by an entire extended family of people who showed up for us during the worst year of my life and never once made me feel like a burden for needing them. She will grow up knowing that her mother built something real out of the wreckage of a terrible year. Not because the wreckage was a gift, and I will never tell her it was, but because refusing to let it be the whole story turned out to be the most important decision I've ever made. She will also, eventually, know the whole truth about her father, not as a villain in a story designed to make me look better by comparison, but as a complicated, flawed man who made genuinely terrible choices, who caused real harm, and who has spent the years since trying, in whatever limited way prison and consequence allow a person to try, to become someone capable of facing what he did. I don't know if that's redemption. I'm not sure it's my job to decide whether it counts as one. I only know that I want her to have the full, complicated truth, because I think a version of her life built on a simpler story, pure villain, pure victim, would be a smaller, less honest life than the one I actually want for her. There is a particular moment, most evenings now, when I stand at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, the same windows that once framed my gilded cage on the worst night of my life, and watch the city go gold and violet as the sun sets over the park. Josie is usually somewhere behind me, negotiating with her nanny over the acceptable number of books for a single bedtime story. And I take a moment, most days, to simply stand there and notice how different the view feels now than it did that first night, when I sank onto the leather sofa and let myself cry for the first time since the hospital. It's the same skyline, the same park, the same lights, the same impossible, glittering expanse of a city that has always been, in its way, a kind of mirror, reflecting back whatever you bring to it, generosity or greed, hope or despair, depending entirely on what you're carrying when you look. That first night, I brought grief and humiliation, and a fury so cold it felt like ice in my veins. And the city gave me back a view of everything I thought I'd lost. Now I bring something else. Not triumph exactly, because triumph implies a war fully won. And I don't think grief ever really finishes being fought. What I bring now is something quieter and more durable than triumph. Something closer to peace. I think sometimes about all the women who never get the version of this story I got. The resources, the lawyers, the father who could freeze a man's entire financial life before sunrise. The company large enough to weather a scandal without collapsing under it. I think about them especially in the quiet moments, standing at this window, because I know, with a clarity I didn't have a year ago, that my recovery was never simply a triumph of character. It was character plus privilege, resilience plus resources. And I've built the foundation specifically to close some small part of that gap for the women who don't have what I had. Because surviving a man's betrayal shouldn't require an inheritance to make it survivable. Marcus retired from active practice 18 months ago, though he still serves on the Foundation's advisory board and calls, occasionally, just to check in, the way a godfather does. Renata Cole runs her own forensic accounting firm now, one that specializes, at my recommendation, in cases exactly like mine. Women trying to untangle a partner's hidden financial deceptions, usually without a fraction of the resources I had at my disposal. Detective Reyes retired from the DA's office 2 years ago and now consults, part-time, for the Foundation's legal aid program, training young attorneys to recognize the particular financial fingerprints of coercive control before it escalates into something worse. Priya married last spring in a ceremony at the same museum that hosted our first gala and asked me to stand beside her, and I did, feeling something close my throat with happiness, watching my closest friend marry a genuinely kind, genuinely steady man who looked at her the way I once, foolishly, believed Grant looked at me. I have not remarried. I have occasionally dated, carefully, slowly, with a caution I don't entirely apologize for, given everything I've learned about how convincingly a person can perform love without actually meaning it. I don't know if I'll marry again. I've stopped needing to know the answer to that question in advance, the way I've stopped needing to know most things about the future before they actually arrive. I've learned over these last several years that certainty was always something of an illusion anyway, that even in the marriage I believed was solid, certainty had been nothing more than a story I was telling myself. One that turned out to be considerably less true than I'd believed. What I have instead of certainty is something I trust more. The evidence of my own resilience, tested under circumstances I would never have chosen and would never wish on another living soul, and found, in the end, to be considerably stronger than I knew. The Foundation's legal aid hotline receives, on an average week, somewhere between 40 and 60 calls, a number that still, 3 years into running it, catches in my chest every time our quarterly reports land on my desk. I don't take the calls myself anymore, not directly. We have a trained staff of over 30 attorneys and advocates now, spread across 4 cities, handling that volume with a professionalism and compassion I couldn't hope to match on my own. But in the early days, before we'd built out the full infrastructure, I used to sit in on calls sometimes, anonymously, just to understand what we were actually building. I remember one call in particular, from a woman in Ohio. I'll call her Renee, though that isn't her real name, since our confidentiality policies are, appropriately, ironclad, who had given birth 6 days earlier and called our hotline from a hospital bathroom because it was the only place in the building where she could speak privately, her husband having left that same afternoon to attend a work function 3 states away, taking with him the only car they owned and leaving her, quite literally, no way to get herself and her newborn home from the hospital at all. The parallels to my own story were close enough that I had to leave the room for a moment before I could compose myself. Renee did not have a father who could freeze accounts by sunrise. She did not have a family attorney who could arrive within the hour with a full legal team. She had, until she found our hotline number taped to a bulletin board in the hospital social work office, essentially nothing. No resources, no plan, no idea how she was going to get herself and her son home, let alone how she was going to build a life that didn't depend on a man who had apparently already decided she and the baby were no longer his priority. We got her a car service that afternoon, the same category of gesture Grant had offered me with such careless condescension, except that for Renee, it wasn't a consolation prize handed down by someone choosing dinner over his family. It was an actual lifeline, coordinated by our emergency response team alongside an attorney who filed for emergency spousal support within 48 hours and a caseworker who helped her secure temporary housing assistance while the custody and support proceedings played out. 18 months later, Renee sent the foundation a letter, unprompted, entirely voluntary, describing how she had used our job training program to complete a certification in medical billing, found stable work, and was, for the first time in her adult life, entirely financially independent of any man's decisions about where his loyalty belonged on any given evening. I keep that letter in the same drawer as Grant's, an odd pairing I've never quite examined too closely, except to notice that both letters, in their very different ways, represent the same fundamental truth I've built the last several years of my life around. That the worst night of a person's life does not have to be the last word on who they become afterward. Grant took years and a federal indictment to reach a version of accountability I still find myself uncertain how fully to trust. Renee needed only a phone number on a bulletin board and 18 months of consistent support to become someone entirely, powerfully changed. Both of those trajectories matter to me. Both of them, in their own way, prove the same point. We have expanded the Foundation's reach every year since that first gala. New clinics, new legal aid partnerships, a pilot program launched last year in 3 states, providing free emergency financial literacy counseling to new mothers, specifically designed to help them recognize, early, the warning signs of financial coercion I never saw in my own marriage until it was already a year deep. I did not build any of this because I wanted to be admired for it, though I know, cynically, that admiration is part of what a foundation like this generates for a woman in my position, regardless of her intentions. I built it because I remember, with total clarity, sitting alone on that leather sofa the first night I was truly alone with my daughter. And I never want another woman to sit in that particular silence without a number to call, without a resource to reach for, without a single person on the other end of the line who understands, immediately and without judgment, exactly what she's going through. She asked me for the first time on a rainy Saturday afternoon in the fall of her 6th year, the two of us curled up on the same leather sofa where I'd once wept alone with her infant self on my chest, a stack of picture books abandoned between us in favor of a conversation neither of us had entirely planned to have. "Mama," she said, with a particular directness only a 6-year-old can manage, unfiltered by adult instincts toward tact. "Why doesn't my daddy live with us? Emma at school has a daddy who picks her up sometimes." I had rehearsed some version of this conversation for years, turning over different phrasings, different levels of detail, trying to find the version that would be honest without being a burden too heavy for a child her age to carry. In the moment, most of that rehearsal fell away, and I found myself simply telling her the truth, in the simplest terms I could manage. "Your daddy made some really big mistakes when you were a baby," I said. "Mistakes that hurt me, and that meant it wasn't safe or right for him to be around us for a long time. He's been working, for a long time now, on becoming a better person because of those mistakes. I don't know yet exactly what that means for whether you'll get to know him someday. But I promise you, whenever you're old enough to have real questions about it, I will always tell you the truth, even the parts that are complicated." She considered this with the grave seriousness of a child working through a genuinely difficult concept. "Was it my fault?" she asked in a small voice, and something in my chest cracked wide open, because I recognized immediately the shape of a fear I'd worked so hard to make sure she'd never have to carry. "No," I said, pulling her close, my voice fierce with a certainty I wanted her to feel in her whole body, not just hear in words. "Josie, listen to me. None of it, not one single part of it, was ever your fault. You were a baby. Babies can't do anything wrong. The choices your daddy made were entirely his own, made by a grown man who is responsible for his own decisions. And they have nothing to do with you, and they never will. You are the very best thing that came out of that whole difficult time. Do you understand me?" She nodded against my shoulder, and we sat together for a long while in the quiet of the apartment, rain streaking down the same windows that had once framed my worst night, now simply framing an ordinary Saturday afternoon with my daughter, safe and loved, and asking exactly the kind of hard, honest questions a child raised with the truth learns to ask. "Can I meet him someday?" she asked eventually. "When I'm older?" "If you want to. When you're old enough to decide that for yourself. And if it's safe, then yes," I said. "That will always be your choice to make, not mine. I'll never keep that decision from you when the time comes. I just want you to have all the information first, so whatever you choose, you're choosing it with open eyes." "Okay," she said, in the simple, trusting way children accept even the most complicated promises, and reached for the next picture book in the stack, the conversation folded away for now, ready to be picked back up whenever she needed it again. I held her a little longer than the moment strictly required, watching the rain, thinking about the woman I'd been on that first terrible night, exhausted, humiliated, riding home alone in a taxi with a newborn, and a heart full of a betrayal she couldn't yet fully comprehend, and feeling, with a gratitude that still occasionally caught me off guard, the full distance I had traveled since then. My father passed the chairman emeritus title, at last, to a purely honorary role 2 years ago, stepping back from even his advisory duties on the board. Not because his mind had dulled in any way, but because, as he put it to me over dinner one evening, a man who has spent 40 years building something has earned the right to spend his final chapter simply enjoying it instead. He and my mother spend most of the year now in the house in the Hamptons that had once been mine alone under the terms of my prenuptial agreement, a fact that still makes him chuckle whenever it comes up, the small, private irony of a legal safeguard designed to protect me from one man's greed becoming, eventually, the setting for his own peaceful retirement, surrounded by grandchildren. Josie has a younger cousin now, my brother's son, born 2 years ago, and the particular contentment of a man who built something that outlasted him in exactly the way he'd hoped. Hale Media and Ventures has grown under my leadership in directions my father never would have predicted and, I think, takes genuine delight in watching unfold. The digital division I built from nothing now accounts for nearly half the company's total revenue. The Josephine Hale Foundation operates in 11 states, with a staff of over 60 and an endowment that has grown, through careful stewardship and the company's continued success, into one of the largest dedicated specifically to postpartum and maternal support in the country. I sit on panels now, testify occasionally before legislative committees on maternal health policy, have become, whether I ever set out to be or not, something of a public voice on issues I once experienced only in the terrible privacy of a single hospital room. None of it erases what happened. I want to be honest about that, in whatever version of the story eventually reaches anyone beyond the people who lived through it alongside me. There is no clean redemption arc here. No tidy bow tied around a genuinely traumatic year that transforms it, retroactively, into something worth the price of admission. I would trade every board seat, every gala, every headline calling me a comeback story for the simple, boring version of my life where Grant Whitmore was exactly the man I believed I married. Where my daughter grew up with two parents who loved each other honestly. Where none of this, the lawyers, the courtroom, the federal case, the letter I still keep in a drawer I rarely open, ever had to happen at all. But that isn't the life I got. And I've stopped, somewhere in these last several years, wasting energy wishing for a different one. Because the energy is better spent building the strongest possible version of the life I actually have. That's not resignation. I want to be clear about that distinction, because I think it matters, especially to any woman reading this who finds herself, right now, in some version of that hospital room, believing her life has just been irreparably broken by a man who chose scallops and status over her and their child. It isn't broken. It's interrupted. There's a difference, and the difference is everything. A broken thing stays broken. An interrupted thing simply changes course, sometimes towards something you'd never have chosen and never, on your worst night, believed you were capable of building. I still have the phone. Not the same physical device, obviously. I've upgraded half a dozen times since that night. But I've transferred carefully from one backup to the next over the years, the screenshot Priyanka took that first evening, the one showing two small dots on a map of Manhattan. Mine, crawling slowly uptown through evening traffic in the back of a taxi that smelled of stale air freshener, and his, motionless outside a restaurant on West 51st Street, glowing steady and unmoving for hours while I rode home alone with our 3-day-old daughter. I don't look at it often. But I kept it, deliberately, because I think there's something important in remembering exactly how small that dot's stillness made me feel that night, and exactly how far I've traveled since, not in miles, since I still live within a few blocks of that same apartment, still look out over the same stretch of Central Park most evenings, but in every other way that actually matters. Josie is 7 now. Fierce and funny and entirely her own person, with my father's stubbornness and my mother's gentleness and, I like to think, some quality entirely her own that neither of us gave her. Something that showed up simply because she is Josephine, singular and irreplaceable, worth every single difficult hour of the year that brought her safely into a life built, eventually, on something far sturdier than the marriage that first delivered her into it. Sometimes, standing at the window in the evening, watching the city go gold and violet the way it did that very first night, I think about the woman I was in that hospital room, exhausted, hopeful, still believing, right up until the moment the maitre d's name left my husband's mouth, that the life she'd built was exactly what it appeared to be. I don't judge her anymore, the way I once might have, for the naivety of that belief. I understand her now the way you understand an earlier draft of yourself. Necessary, imperfect, doing the absolute best she could with the information she had at the time. She just didn't yet know what she was capable of building once that information finally, painfully caught up with her. I know now. I've spent the years since finding out, one difficult, deliberate decision at a time, freezing an account, filing a petition, launching a foundation, standing at a podium telling a room full of strangers the truth about what vulnerability actually costs a woman with nowhere else to turn. None of it undid that first night. None of it was supposed to. What it did instead, slowly, was build something entirely new on top of the wreckage. Not a replacement for what I lost, but a life, genuinely mine, that I would not trade now for the one I thought I was living before the dot on that map stopped moving, and never, for the rest of that agonizing night, moved again. The story of the woman who rode home alone in a taxi is not the whole story. It never was. It was only ever the first chapter of a much longer one, and I am, finally, exactly the woman writing the rest of it myself. The end. If you are reading this at 3 in the morning, phone propped against a pillow, a baby finally asleep after an hour of trying, and some version of my first night still fresh enough to sting, I want to say a few things directly to you, the way I wish someone had said them to me. What happened to you is not a referendum on your judgment. I know how loud that voice gets in the small hours, the one insisting you should have seen it coming, that some clue was there all along if only you'd been paying closer attention. I have heard that voice. I have argued with it at 2 in the morning more times than I can count, and I want you to hear this plainly. The fact that you loved someone honestly and trusted them the way any reasonable person trusts a spouse is not a character flaw. It is the ordinary, decent risk every person takes when they choose to build a life with someone else. The failure, when it comes, belongs entirely to the person who chose to betray that trust. It does not transfer to you, no matter how many times your own mind tries to hand you the bill. You do not need my father's resources to survive this. I want to be honest about how much privilege shaped my own path through that year. The lawyers who arrived within the hour, the accounts frozen by sunrise, the company large enough to absorb a scandal without buckling. Most women don't have that, and if you're one of them, I want you to know it changes the mechanics of your recovery, but not the fact of it. There are resources built, in part, because women who lived through some version of what I lived through decided that no one should have to do it entirely alone. Reach for them. Call a hotline. Ask a friend to sit with you while you make the first difficult phone call. Asking for help is not a failure of the strength you're going to need. It is the strength. Grief and fury can occupy the same body at the same time, and you do not owe anyone a tidy explanation of which one you're feeling on any given hour. I spent months confused by how quickly I could move from devastation to cold, clear-eyed strategy and back again, sometimes within the same conversation. And I want you to know that this is not instability. It is simply what surviving something enormous actually looks like from the inside. Messier, less linear, and considerably more human than any story, including this one, can fully capture on the page. And finally, the child who brought you to this crossroads, whatever the circumstances of how you got here, is not the price of your suffering. She or he is the reason the suffering was survivable at all. I built an entire company's public identity around that idea, eventually, but I felt it first in a much smaller, much more private way. Sitting on a cold leather sofa with my daughter's small fist curled around my finger, discovering that even on the worst night of my life, I was not, in the truest sense, alone. You aren't either. Whatever this night looks like for you, it is not the whole story. It is only, ever, the first chapter, and you are far more capable of writing the rest of it than the darkness currently insists you are. I think often about how little anyone prepares you for the specific physical reality of those first days after birth. Not the general concept of exhaustion, which every book and every well-meaning relative warns you about in the abstract, but the granular bodily truth of it. The way your body feels borrowed rather than owned. Still swollen and sore in places you didn't know could ache. Stitches pulling with every small shift of weight. Your own reflection in the hospital bathroom mirror, looking like someone you recognize only distantly. A woman wearing your face, but none of your usual composure. Nobody tells you that the hormonal drop after birth can feel, in its rawest hours, like grief with no object, a sorrow with no clear cause, arriving in waves that have nothing to do with whether anything is actually wrong. I didn't understand, in the immediate aftermath of that first terrible night, how much of my devastation was Grant's betrayal, and how much was simply my body's own chemistry, recalibrating after 9 months of pregnancy and the seismic event of labor. And I don't think it matters, in the end, to separate the two cleanly. They arrived together, tangled, and I had to survive both at once, without the luxury of untangling them first. I think about the nurse who helped me into the wheelchair that first night, the careful, practiced kindness in her hands. The way she didn't ask a single follow-up question when I told her, flatly, that my husband had a prior engagement. The particular grace of a woman who had clearly seen every version of this story before and knew better than to make me narrate mine out loud in a hospital corridor. I never learned her name. I think about her more often than I think about almost anyone else from that night. This stranger who managed in 5 quiet minutes to treat me with more genuine care than my husband had managed in the preceding hour. I think about Malcolm, our doorman, rushing out into the cold without his coat properly buttoned, lifting my daughter's carrier like it held something infinitely precious, offering me his arm without a single question, and I think about how much of my survival that first year depended on exactly that kind of unglamorous, unbilled kindness. People showing up in small, practical ways, asking nothing in return, simply because decency required it and they happened to be decent. These are not the parts of the story anyone puts in a headline. Nobody writes, "Heiress recovers thanks to kind doorman and unnamed nurse." The narrative always wants the lawyers, the federal case, the dramatic reversal of fortune, because that's the version with a clear arc, a clean villain, a satisfying comeuppance. But if I'm honest about what actually carried me through the hardest stretch of that year, it wasn't only the legal machinery my father mobilized within an hour, as extraordinary as that was. It was also this quieter constellation of ordinary people who happened to be kind to me at exactly the moment I needed it most. None of whom will ever read this, none of whom I could properly thank even if I tried. I try to build some version of that same unglamorous decency into everything the Foundation does now. Not just the headline-grabbing grants and the gala announcements, but the smaller, less visible parts of the work. A hotline volunteer who stays on the phone an extra 20 minutes because a caller isn't ready to hang up yet. A caseworker who remembers a client's baby's name 6 months after the case file has technically closed. I think that's the real inheritance of that terrible night. More than the lawsuit, or the company, or even the foundation itself. An understanding, learned the hardest possible way, that the difference between surviving and merely enduring often comes down to whether someone, anyone, treats you like you still matter on the night you feel most certain that you don't. Author's note: this story is a work of fiction. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is entirely coincidental. It is dedicated to every mother who has ever ridden home alone. Someday you'll read all of this properly, not the careful, age-adjusted fragments I've given you across 100 bedtime conversations, but the whole thing, start to finish, in your own time and at your own pace. I want you to know, before you do, that I wrote it as honestly as I knew how. Not to make myself the hero of it, though I understand it might read that way in places, but because I wanted you to have a true record rather than a comfortable one. You will probably find parts of your father's letter difficult to read. I found them difficult to receive. You may find yourself at some point wanting to reach out to him yourself. And if that day comes, I want you to know I will support whatever you decide, without reservation, and without making you carry my own complicated feelings about him as a condition of your choice. He is your father. Whatever he failed to be for a long stretch of your childhood, that fact alone will always be true. And you get to decide, entirely on your own terms, what to do with it. I also want you to know that none of the difficulty in this story was ever about you. You were the reason I found the strength to fight through all of it in the first place. Not a complication I had to manage alongside the fight, but the actual point of the fight itself. Every account frozen, every filing, every long night at a kitchen island covered in legal pads, every gala and every grant, and every hard conversation with a reporter, all of it, in the end, was really just one long, complicated way of trying to build you a life sturdy enough to stand on, regardless of how unsteady the ground looked on the night it began. I love you completely and without condition, exactly as I have from the very first moment I held you in a hospital room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and cashmere, 3 days before the whole world tilted sideways and I had to learn, faster than I ever wanted to, how to stand up straight inside it anyway. You were always worth every bit of that learning. Ga, Mom.